I'd like to ask you about your Vietnam War service. Firstly, um, did you agree with the Vietnam War at the time and now?
No, and no.
Why?
Well, I didn't think it was our war, really. We'd got into it unnecessarily. It was an unpopular war anyhow down here, I thought. But there was no question that any part I played, I played. You know, in the Navy, you're apolitical and you do what you're told. But I didn't feel strongly about it. In fact, I was rather keen to get in a bit closer, and if we could have fired a gun one morning, it would have been nice for all my ship's company. They would have finished up with a Vietnam medal sort of thing instead of only a logistic medal. But apart from that, at the back of my mind, I wasn't terribly keen on it. I wasn't violent. I wouldn't have marched against it if I was down here. But I just felt it was one that we needn't have really got into. But you're asking about my Vietnam War, as I mentioned earlier to Colin. I wasn't really in it very much. You know, we were on the outskirts. I can remember the crew were all, very few of them had been in my wars before with me. I was the old man. You can be an old man in the Navy when you're still very young, really, because the kids were all about 19 or 20. And as we left Manus to sail across towards the Philippines, where we were joining up with the fleet for the exercises and the eventual collision and going towards Vietnam, they were saying, "Oh, sir, can you get on the blower and tell us a worry or two?" And I was saying, "Yes, why not? In this water, in 1944, I was here in a destroyer, and I'd tell them some exciting story about how we nearly had a collision with an American carrier in the middle of the night or something." And they were all kids who were mad keen on, they loved the Navy, or I hope they did, they seemed to be enjoying the time on board. And if you're in the Navy, you like the idea of something a bit more than a peacetime exercise. So they would have loved to, if I could have wangled it. In fact, I think I found out later that if I'd gone in about another 50 miles one day, I would have been within the area that would have entitled us to the Vietnam War Medal as opposed to the Logistic Medal. And if I'd known that at the time, I would have sort of disobeyed the Admiral and sailed in anyhow. But I didn't know, and so they never did. So you don't worry very much about the politics of war. When you're in the war, you do what you're told, and that's it, really.
What sort of operations were you so logistically? Are you just supplying the troops in for
No, we were just supplying fuel to the ships. We never got in into Vietnamese close waters. That was the point. We would fuel the destroyer that had been on the gun line firing away. It would come out, and we'd give it some more fuel, and it would go back in. Or we'd meet up with the Sydney, who'd been coming up from Australia, was running short of fuel. We'd give her some fuel, we'd go in. And it was a very short time we were there, really.
Did you ever get shore leave?
Oh, no, we never went into Vietnam at all. No. Shore leave we got was in Manila Harbour, where some of our sailors got into mischief at the various...
What happened there?
Well, I don't know, sailors get into mischief in ports. And
yes, you do.
I remember as I sailed, I delayed sailing for half an hour next morning because one of our sailors was still missing, and I finally said, "Can't wait any longer," and I slipped, and we had a tug pulling us out from the wharf, and then rushing down the wharf was the sailor, and he dived into the water and swam out, and I stopped the engine, and he actually we got him on board, and I dealt with him sometime in the future for being late, but I never sailed without a sailor again. That was the only time. And he said he'd had a lovely time ashore, and it was worth the punishment I gave him.
We all know what he was up to then, don't we? Throughout your career in the Navy, tell us how discipline was instilled, like punishment. For instance, someone who broke the rules. Did it change in the years from World War II to Vietnam?
Very little, I think. Discipline is not punishment, as I think of it. Discipline is knowing how you've all got to pull together towards the end in sight. And if the discipline breaks down, then punishment has to be administered. I didn't always agree with some of the rather strict rules that we'd inherited and the strict outlook that we'd inherited from the British Navy. They were too much them and us. I know when I got to the British cruiser that I mentioned earlier that I joined for the Normandy landings, I was the divisional officer for the forecastle division, all the sailors in the front end of the ship. And we were in harbour, I think, might have been Colombo or somewhere. And I was leaning on the guardrail on the forecastle talking to one of my able seamen. And I was saying, you know, where do you come from? Oh, that part of the world. And you got a wife, any children? And I was getting to know him, because the job of a divisional officer, as we call them in the Navy, is to know the people under them and if they have any problems. I mean, from then on I would know, yes, he's got a wife at home. I better remember that next time I see him. I'll say, how's your wife? And if he has to say, oh, she left me for another man, I'd be able to sympathise, sort of thing. And in the middle of this, somebody tapped me on the shoulder and said, the commander wants to see you, sir. So I went along to the quarterdeck and saluted the commander. He said, Smyth, you were talking to a rating, leaning on the guardrails. And I said, yes, sir, he's one of my sailors. I'm getting to know him. You don't hobnob with the sailors like that in this ship. I said, well, I'm sorry, in any ship I've ever been in, my job is to get to know my sailors. And the more human I can be in the process, I can't remember now exactly what I said, but that's what I felt. And he said, oh, no, you do not hobnob with the sailors here. There's them and us, more or less. And that was the RN, and we had inherited a lot of that in our Navy because of all the training we'd done. And I think that was the hardest thing I had to overcome in my early days, realising that old Joe Blow, who I was at school with and who's up in the forecastle, I wasn't really meant to talk to because he was a lower deck and I was upper deck, sort of thing. It's got much better since. I've been delighted when I've gone out in any ships now to find that they virtually use Christian names to the captain, but they still treat him like the captain. And it's a very subtle change in those 60 years between the harsh discipline and the human discipline of today.
So what about punishment, though? What sort of punishments would you...
Punishment, you used to give people, if they were late coming on board, you'd give them a week's extra duties, which would mean not going, no, leave would be stopped. They would have punishment drill for an hour every afternoon in the dog watches between 4 and 5 in the afternoon. If it got more serious, you could put them in cells. Very seldom did I see that. If it was really serious and they'd got into trouble ashore and disgraced the uniform or something, they'd be sent away for 3 months in a military establishments, prison really. We didn't have naval prisons, but we had naval. We had a cell in every bigger ship, like the Australia, would have a couple of cells up for it, and occasionally there'd be a couple of people locked away in that for a week, being given oakum to pick, which is just sorting out rope, teasing out the rope so that you can put it in the gaps between the planks on the upper deck and then seal it with pitch. It's a sort of naval tradition to pick oakum, but now that we no longer have wooden decks, they don't pick oakum, I'm sure, because there'd be no point in it. So punishment was tougher then, I suppose, but we were certainly long past the day of, well, we never actually had walking the plank, but there were, in Nelson's day, there was lots and lots of this whipping, 50 lashes, or even put them in a boat and take them round the fleet, and alongside every ship the poor chap would be given 10 lashes, and then he'd row on to the next ship and he'd be given another 10 lashes and he'd be cut down at the end almost dead. Now that had all gone. We were almost human.
So that never happened in the Australian Navy, lashes?
No.
In World War II, that is?
No, never, because the Navy was only formed in 1901 and we were fairly human by then, I think.
Was that a practice in World War I? Would you happen to know?
No, I don't think so. I think it had gone, I'd say halfway through the 19th century, 1850, it had probably disappeared by then. But as I say, our captain, I mentioned earlier, was all for hanging those two murderers, and we started doing the drill. And it was all laid down in a book, how you do it. Starboard yard arm, leading stoker Gordon, hoist, and the starboard watch would man the rope on the starboard side with the band playing drum, 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 would double away, and up would go poor leading stoker Gordon until he got close up to the upper yard arm, and then a toggle would be pulled out of the rope and he would drop 6 feet. But 6 feet was not the exact length to drop, because leading stoker Gordon was a big heavy stoker. The table that existed then, I imagine it still lists somewhere, meant that if you were weighing 15 stone, you only dropped 5 foot 1 inch. The other chap, Stoker Elias, he was only a pipsqueak of about 8 stone. He had to drop 7 feet, because that final drop is what broke their neck. And we were all doing this and saying, we're not really going to do this, are we? Unfortunately, as I say, the Navy officer heard about it.
Otherwise it would have been done.
Well, we were practicing it. I think he might have only meant it in, to bring it home to us that you don't murder people in my ship. But as far as we were concerned, it looked as if we were going to do it.
Life out at sea, over the years, you must have also encountered strange, perhaps examples of nature, such as sea creatures and weather. And
weather, certainly. The typhoons are what one remembers. I mentioned earlier crossing the Bight, one of my first trips. It was very rough, and you get very rough water down south of Australia, around Tasmania, even in Bass Strait. But the typhoon or the tropical storm, like the hurricanes they have up north, like the one that flattened Darwin in 1975, up in the northern hemisphere they're called typhoons. And we were right in amongst them during those last few months of the war. And they were quite frightening. They were enormous waves and enormous winds. We were in about 3 different ones. There was one when we were hove to, we were by ourselves, we were virtually stopped with revolutions for about 10 knots, but not making any way through the water, facing into the sea, and if we had tried to move one way or the other, we might well have rolled over. And we received a signal from a poor little American cargo ship, which was only about 10 miles away, and it said, "We are in the apparent centre of the typhoon. We are abandoning ship." And we couldn't do anything about it. Had we turned to go over to them, we would have probably rolled over. That was the last that was heard of them. There were no survivors, and the ship went down. We were caught in Tokyo Bay just after the war by a typhoon, and the bay was full of ships. We'd all sort of gathered there for the victory celebrations, really, and we were all told to get to sea. I was up on the forecastle trying to weigh the anchor, and it was out almost lying straight ahead of us, and our winch just wouldn't work. It couldn't pull it in against the ships. So we dragged backwards through the ships for about half an hour, the captain sort of seeing the ships coming up astern and going full ahead port and half astern starboard and somehow trying to miss them, and then finally he somehow was able to steam ahead enough for me to get the anchor up, and we steamed out of Tokyo Bay, somehow avoiding collisions and things. But standing on the forecastle, I was at an angle like that into the wind, because if you tried to stand up, you'd just be blown over. 200 kilometres an hour wind sort of thing, which really flatten you completely. So those seas were tremendous. On the way south from Tokyo Bay, we called into Okinawa for fuel. The typhoon was still some distance away, but the swell had already arrived. And so whilst we were alongside this tanker in the harbour, we were crashing into it. Every time the ships rolled on the swell, we would crash in, and we got enough fuel, but we came away with all our guardrails and one of our seaboats stove in from just trying to get some fuel in harbour. So, yes, storms like that. And the Atlantic gales, of course, well known. I didn't get much time in the Atlantic, really. I was more, we were up in Scapa Flow and for the D-Day landings and things, and the Channel, where I was in motor gunboats, we got rough weather, but nothing like the big storms. You asked about animals. I never saw a sea serpent. Saw lots of whales and lots of sea snakes up in the tropics. The sea snakes, you can see them at any one time. You can probably see 3 or 4 of the big yellow thick sea snakes, which are very poisonous, I'm told. And the coral snakes, which have got the different colours in bands down them, you get them more in the harbours, Manus Harbour and Port Moresby, places like that. Nasty things like we were in the Barrier Reef at one stage during the war, having a bit of a rest and recreation, I suppose you'd call it now. We were in for a few days, and we landed a lot of sailors on the beach of one of the islands there. And the boat, not the boat I was in, but just close to us, they all hopped out into the water when the water was shallow enough for them to walk ashore, and one of them hopped straight onto a Portuguese man-of-war. And he screamed and said, "My God, something's got me." They put him back in the boat, took him straight back to the ship, and he was dead by the time they got him on board. These nasty Portuguese men-of-war are not much fun. When I was in my ship up in Darwin, the frigate Hawkesbury, where we were looking after the Japanese pearl fleet, I was going out every week or so for a week or 10 days, making sure that they were allowed to pearl, but they weren't allowed to land on Australian shores.
When was this?
This was 1953, 54. Japanese pearlers were very good at the job, and they were doing it. And I took the Prime Minister out actually one day to have a look at them, and they presented him with things which he then passed on to me, and I passed on to my children. But one of our sailors, when we were in the harbour in Darwin one day, they were on one of the main Darwin beaches, and they picked up a pretty little octopus, which had little blue rings on its tentacles. They'd never heard of it, I'd never heard of it. They were playing with it, they tossed it from one chap to the other, and one chap had it on his shoulder, sort of saying, you know, take a photograph of me. Oh, it seems to have bitten me. And within seconds almost, he was saying, I don't feel too good. By the time he got up to his towel, he was sort of passing out. They had a jeep there, they rushed him to the hospital. He was dead on arrival. He was the first blue ring octopus fatality in Australia. We'd never heard of them. From there, they sort of, fortunately the other chap, I think he'd either kept the octopus or knew where it was, still lying on the beach. And from that, we've all been told ever since, stay away from blue ring octopuses. One of my sailors was the first victim of it. So there are nasty things in the sea. Sharks we caught a lot. There's a photograph in one of those albums of a shark we caught at Mauritius one day. I don't know how they put a line over, a heavy line with a hunk of meat, and they hoisted him out on the crane, and he was about 15 feet long, I suppose, and you can see people standing beside him, and he's more than twice their height, you know. But you meet sharks everywhere.
Do sharks normally follow convoys?
I don't think they'd bother to follow, no.
Because of like junk being thrown overboard?
They might a bit, I suppose, yes. The things that follow, of course, the porpoises and dolphins, they sort of precede you, they lead you along rather beautifully, the way they're leaping out of the water in front of your bows. But no, sharks, I've never met anybody who's been attacked by one or anything, but you're always very careful in tropical waters. You like having the opportunity, I often used to do it, of stopping over fairly shallow water and saying, right, we'll stay here for half an hour if anyone wants to put a line over the side. And then towards the end we'd say, all right, in 5 minutes' time it'll be hands to bathe, close up 2 or 3 riflemen, and everyone would hop over the side and swim, not go very far away, and you'd have riflemen in case sharks did appear, but I don't remember ever having to shoot at one. But we took those precautions. In Manus Harbour we used to put 2 booms over the side and set up a water polo pitch, water polo, whatever you call it, ground, no, it's not a ground, it's anyway, in the water alongside us, and we'd challenge other ships to water polo, but you'd always have a chap with a rifle standing by in case. But I've never known of a shark attack as such.
Must be interesting. Through the war, or more specifically, the Second World War. How do you think it impacted on your life?
Oh, it obviously impacted, I suppose. If I hadn't joined, if the Navy hadn't invented that new entry into the Navy, and if there hadn't been a war, I would have left school, I would have gone to some university, I don't know what I would have done. I would have possibly gone back to the farm and taken on farming and been a sheep farmer for the rest of my life, or I might have done something clever and been in the city. I think I would have liked to stay in the country. But, you can't visualise. I mean, 6 years out of my life was suddenly World War II. A very formative 6 years. It obviously formed me for the rest of my life. It impacted on my life, but because I was never wounded or sunk, I used to get burnt absolutely black. Far darker than you up in the tropics. I would sit on the bridge all afternoon watch or forenoon watch with just a pair of shorts on, and I'd get myself burnt absolutely black because I'd seen so many people who were cooked to death in lifeboats. I said, that'll never happen to me when I'm sunk, and of course I was never sunk. So now what happens? I've got keratosis and skin cancers and things, all from being the silly boy then, but it didn't seem silly at the time. It seemed a sensible precaution, and it was fun to burn yourself. As my headmaster used to say, burning your beastly bodies black in the sun.
We can get a solarium now. Would you say that your memories of the war are the strongest memories you have?
No, my memories of the Navy are. I think if you...
That's what I mean, your actual service, your war service.
Yes, not only war service, no, a lot of the peacetime service. The dreams I have, and I often find myself dreaming that I'm back in a ship. I'm either the captain of it or I'm the sort of second in command being told by the captain to do something. And it's never actually sort of firing guns, it's more avoiding reefs and remembering the one I nearly landed the ship on in such and such an Inigo harbour in 1954 or something, more so than during the war when I wasn't captain of my own ships in any of the wars except Vietnam, and I wasn't really in that war so much. And I think it was the time in command when your responsibility is so supreme, far more probably than in any other service or situation. You've got a ship, and the safety of the ship is in your hands, but also you've got 200 men, and their safety and their well-being is in your hands. And it is the most complete responsibility I can imagine. You know, you can be chairman of the BHP, but you've always got dozens of people to sort of straighten you out if you're going wrong. But if you're captain of a ship, you are the captain. You are alone. You've got nobody to refer to, really. You can be friendly with your first lieutenant and your officers, but you never quite say, what would you do now? You've got to decide it yourself. Will you go into this harbour even though you've got no charts? I remember going through a channel in the Solomons in 1954 in my frigate, Booker Passage it's called, and we knew that the Japanese destroyers had gone through there during the war because they had command of that island. And so I said, well, if they can go through, I'll go through. And I was quite a big ship, 2,000 tons, and I drew 12 feet of water. And we got hold of a Japanese chart. And I said, now I've got a chart, I should be able to get through. Halfway through, I realised that the soundings under my bottom, which I thought would have been about 6 or 8 feet, were 2 feet and 1 feet. I was skimming on top of the bottom. And suddenly in front of me I saw a horse standing on the water. I thought, it looked like it. As I got closer, I edged around to the left of him, and he was standing on a platform of coral that had come right out from the shore, and he was standing in about 3 inches of water. And just beside it, it went straight down, and I went past looking down at this horse, and he was looking up at me. By this time my nerves weren't very good, and the soundings were still telling me I only had a foot of water under me. I got through the far end, I didn't hit the bottom. I stopped the ship and I said, let's sort this out with my navigator, and we looked at the chart. I suddenly said, what would Japanese soundings be in? He said, probably meters. And I said, we've been assuming that when it says 3, it means 3 fathoms. A fathom is 6 feet. A metre is 3 feet. I thought I was in, shall we say, 15, well, say 3 fathoms, that's 18 feet of water. In fact, I was in 12 feet of water. And that's the sort of thing I still dream about. I have not quite a nightmare, but that sort of thing. You know, I'm suddenly driving through that place again and realising that I'm putting my ship and my sailors at risk. So they're the things you remember. When you're in command, that's what you remember, I think. Jobs ashore, again, you've always got somebody to turn to. But in command of a ship is a unique situation, I still think. Probably driving an aeroplane, but so much it's automatic these days, you don't have to make those sort of decisions nearly as much. And you're always within cooey of the ground. I would be away. I sailed from Darwin at one stage and came across a Japanese ship. It was asking permission to land somebody who was sick. I didn't think he should. I made a signal to Navy office in Melbourne, more or less saying, requesting instructions, which was silly of me because the signal didn't get through for about 3 hours. And by the time the signal came back saying, it is up to you to decide, I had to decide anyhow. And I didn't let him land and I made him go away and I kept going. So in other words, perhaps today you can pick up the phone and talk to the Prime Minister, like when children are overboard or something, but certainly in my day, communications were so doubtful that you had to make decisions yourself completely about anything that came up.
Did you tell your children about your war service?
Oh, I occasionally tell them, I think. They used to get rather sick of it, and finally they said, Dad, you should write it down. So we had a Christmas about 5 years ago. They were all gathered here, and I said, by the way, I'm going to do it. Do what? They said. I said, you've been telling me I should write my life story. I'm going to do it. Oh, Dad, what for? And I said, well, you've been telling me. I thought it'd be interesting to write it. They said, you're not going to publish it. And I said, well, I've been publishing these other books of my paintings. This will be full of paintings that I'll paint of my life as I remember it. You're not going to, how many are you going to print? And I said, well, my normal print runs about 2,000 books. Oh, Dad, about 200 is all you'll ever get rid of that book. Well, there's one that he's got now to take with him. And I have sold quite a few of them. So then they had the book they could read and I didn't have to bore them anymore with stories. They've been great supporters. They gave me a lovely picture on my 80th birthday, which is up there. One of my children is a graphic artist, and she put together what she thought my 80 years of life consisted of. There's a picture of me. I'm wearing a naval coat. I'm in a Boy Scout shorts because I was a Boy Scout leader and a Boy Scout. There are pictures all around. There's a shrine where I've been a trustee for years. There's one of my ships. There's a picture of my wife. There's a pile of the books I've printed and pushed out. There's a sheep somewhere because I was brought up in a sheep farm. And that was presented to me by my children on my 80th birthday last year, which was rather fun to get. So they laugh at their dad, but I think they get along all right and respect him.
Did you dream about the war, or do you still?
Well, as I say, I dream a lot about Navy. I'm sort of doing funny things. Half the time I'm dodging rocks. But it's not so much the war, it's more my peacetime time in command. War doesn't seem to worry. I'm lucky. I wasn't one of the soldiers who went through absolute hell anywhere. Even when we were being bombed at Normandy, and I remember one night the bombs were getting closer and closer, and I lay down on the deck and I thought, this is bloody silly. If it's going to hit me, it'll do it just as much if I'm standing up. So I stood up and I hoped nobody had seen me. But you know, that was the nearest, perhaps, those sort of occasions. But I never actually copped a bit of shrapnel in the guts or something. So I haven't got that very personal feeling of real fear and pain that so many soldiers in Yemen who are shot down out of the sky. I've been lucky. And so my memories are of 40 years in the Navy, yes, but none of it, they're not really nightmares, they're just happy dreams that take me back into the dream world that I used to be in.
Did you have any nightmares?
I don't think so, really, no. Occasionally you do, but they're nothing to do with the Navy. I think you're falling off a high place or something funny. I'm never quite sure how you define a nightmare. If you wake up from a dream and you don't want to go back to sleep because the dream might go on and might lead to something nasty, that's the nearest I get to a nightmare, I think. So I stay awake.
What did you think about the countries you fought against and their people? Germany, Japan, Italy?
Japan, we had a less respect for than the Germans, but as I mentioned earlier, meeting one or two of them afterwards, people who had been in their navy, I had just as much respect for them as sailors. There's a brotherhood of the sea, which is much more than any brotherhood of armed forces, like the army would have. You're fighting the sea half the time, not your enemy, and any time you met up with... I met a lot after the war. I know when I was in London, I was our naval attaché, and the German naval attaché and the Italian naval attaché were amongst my best friends, amongst the attachés' union. And we talked over the war, and we once or twice realised we'd been pretty close to one another and possibly almost shooting at one another. But they were all... they were naval people, and naval people are peculiar in a way. There's a great... And not only Navy, merchant Navy too. We've drawn away from the merchant Navy in peacetime. A lot of the young naval officers I meet now haven't really got to know people in the merchant Navy, which is a pity, because that brotherhood of the sea cemented us all together during the war. We were convoying them, they were being sunk even more than we were, and the people you met, you knew that they were facing the same dangers, and there was a tremendous brotherhood. And whether they were German survivors you picked up, which we never did actually, but if you had, you would have treated them the same as your own survivor, I'm sure, because they were facing the same dangers. Some of the films bring that out quite well, I think. There's that famous one, The Cruel Sea. Have you ever seen that?
I don't believe so.
It's a pretty ancient one now. Came out 10 years after the war, Nicholas Montserrat. And there's the awful picture where he has attacked a submarine, the submarine has sunk a ship, and then he's picked up the submarine Echo again, and he's coming in to attack it, and he realises that right over the submarine are all the survivors in the water from the ship, his own ship, a merchant ship that has been sunk by the submarine, and he's got to decide. They think he's coming in to save them. He knows he's coming in to depth charge the submarine and kill them. And this would have been a terrible decision for anyone to make. And it's made in the film. He does go in and he drops his depth charges, and his sailors almost disown him on the spot. But, those are the sort of decisions, because friend or foe, how do you play it? You're all men of the sea, and how can you cope with decisions like that?
Did you ever have any close shaves with submarines, personally? Enemy
Well,
submarines, of course?
No, I don't think so. We attacked this submarine, as I said earlier, off Korea in the early days of the Korean War. I think we might have even got it. It was obviously not a North Korean submarine. They didn't have one. It was pretty obviously, if it was genuinely a submarine, and we thought it was pretty obviously a Russian one, which was down there. They shouldn't have been there. If they were there, they should have told us they were going to be there, but they were the potential enemy, and I think we might have sunk a Russian submarine, but it was never claimed or acknowledged. But no, none of the convoys I did, which was sort of off the west coast of Africa, it wasn't like the convoys crossing the Atlantic, which was U-boat alley. And I crossed the Atlantic several times, but we were never attacked in the ships I was in. And I was never in the ships escorting the convoys to and fro in the Atlantic. That's where you see those awful pictures of ships being blown up all round, and the escorts rushing around trying to find the submarines who were there in a wolf pack. That was the phrase they used for them. They would have shadowed the convoy, which was going pretty slowly all day, and then they moved in like a wolf pack at night. and it would have been terrible there, some of the losses. Some of the convoys that lost, you know, out of 30 ships, there were 20 ships sunk, that sort of thing. And nearly every time so many people lost their lives. They'd normally have one escort told off to rush around and pick up survivors, but if there were 20 ships being sunk in the length of a night, you probably didn't get to some of the sites where they'd gone down. So the sea is a cruel place, and that was a wonderful title for the picture, The Cruel Sea.
Is there any instances where convoys were completely destroyed?
Almost, I think, yes. Some of the Russian convoys, there's a particular one, I think it was called PQ-11 or something, and it virtually lost everything in it. And another one of the Malta convoys, out of about 15 ships, 3 got in. One of them was the tanker, the Ohio, an American tanker, and it had been bombed and set on fire and had sunk in the water. It was almost sinking, and a destroyer got along one side of it and a frigate on the other, and they lashed themselves to it, and they brought it into harbour in Malta by sort of holding it up themselves, and that saved Malta because they had no more petrol for their aeroplanes to fight off the attackers, and stores. One of the other ships also got in full of stores, and that saved Malta. But that was a convoy that virtually was, you know, out of 15 fast modern ships, 3 got in. Whether there was any that was 100%, I'm not quite sure. Could have been smaller ones. Or certainly there was a smaller one north of Australia, only 3 ships. The Yarra was escorting it out from Java coming south, and 5 Japanese ships, 3 cruisers and 2 destroyers found them. Yarra turned towards and took them on, was blown out of the water, and then the other 3 ships were sunk too. The captain of Yarra should have got a Victoria Cross. We've never had a Victoria Cross in our Navy. He was one who perhaps should have. But because he was sunk, he didn't get anything. But he was sunk.
It's better to live, isn't
facing
it?
fearful odds, as they say.
Yes. Okay, well, we're coming pretty close to the end of the interview now. So I'll ask you a few more quick questions and
You want quick answers?
not quick answers, but I mean quick questions, short questions. Okay, this is related to just what you may have experienced. Did you ever encounter cowardice or desertion throughout your service, either in Korea, Vietnam, or World War II?
No. No, I encountered fear. I think the first time we took on an enemy battery at Korea with a ship's company, most of whom had not been in World War II, I remember the chief stoker was sort of up on deck from his engine room having a look at the scenery and wondering what we were doing, and suddenly the shells started arriving both sides of the ship. We were being straddled, as they call it. And he said something that, in the way of a swear word, sort of, "My God, Christ Almighty," and dived down into his stokehold, which was where he should have been anyhow. Now that was fear, but not cowardice. He went back to his job where he thought it was safer because he couldn't see what was happening. And quite a lot of the sailors that day, I think, got a rather sudden introduction to what warlike feelings can be, because when one shell's gone over and one's gone short, you think, Christ, the next one's going to hit me. And I had the same fear myself, but cowardice, no, I never saw any.
What about heroism?
I think everyone is a hero all the time, but I can't remember any specific bits that would have... my own captain in Korea was always sort of on the bridge acting like Nelson, but we were all hoping that we were acting like Nelson too, and he wasn't having to face up to anything specifically personal. He was just hoping he'd get his ship through and his crew through, I think.
Yes, okay. I'll ask you one last question. If there's anything you'd like to say that we haven't asked, or for the record, you're most welcome to at this stage. We're almost out of tape.
Well, I think a naval life is a wonderful life, and it's a safer life in many ways, although in fact in World War II we lost a higher percentage of naval people than either the Army or the Air Force, so it's not really safe in wartime. If a ship goes down with all hands, like the Sydney does, or did in 1941, that's a tremendous sort of hole out of your navy. So it's not really safe, but whilst you're still in the ship, you're sleeping in a comfortable bunk or a hammock, you can even have sheets, you get a fairly good meal. I'd far rather be in the Navy than the Army and the Air Force, and I takes my hat off to the Army and Air Force people who put up with what they have to put up with. And if I had another war and I was a young man again, it's still the Navy I would join.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Perfect last words. We'll remember that.